In the windswept grasslands of Mongolia, beneath skies that stretched endlessly across the horizon, a boy was born into chaos, nameless in the records of kings, yet destined to conquer more of the world than any emperor before him. He was not born in a palace, nor cradled in gold, but in blood, betrayal, and barren earth. His name?
Temujin.
History would remember him as Genghis Khan, the scourge of heaven, the unifier of tribes, the storm that shook the world. This is not just the tale of conquest. This is the tale of survival, of vengeance, of a leader who rose from nothing to forge the largest land empire the world has ever seen. A man feared by empires and followed by millions. Glow showing Europe, Africa, what price did the world pay for his ambition? Broken heart, what did he sacrifice to rise above all others? Stay with us as we uncover the true story behind the man, the myth, the Khan. Bell, if you're passionate about untold legends and historical truth wrapped in emotion and power, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices back to life. Now, let the storm begin. The story of Genghis Khan begins not in the grandeur of empires or on the throne of kings, but in the bitter cold winds of the vast Mongolian steppes. Around the year 1162, beneath a sky so endless it seemed to swallow time, a boy was born into violence, uncertainty, and exile. His name was Temujin. He did not come into a world that embraced him. He entered a realm ruled by clans and chaos, where power belonged to those who could wield a bow, ride like the wind, and kill without hesitation. He was born into the Borjigin clan, a lineage descended from a warrior named Bodonkar, but nobility in Mongolia meant nothing without strength to enforce it. His father, Yasugi, was a respected warlord, the chief of the Kiad tribe, known for his cunning and martial skill. His mother, Holun, was taken from her first husband during a raid, stolen as spoils of war, yet she became the rock on which Temujin's spirit was built. Her eyes, filled with fire, never looked away from pain, and it was her hands that would teach Temujin how to claw survival from the earth. Temujin's birth was marked by a sign. According to legend, he was born clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, an omen that he was destined to become a great warrior. But greatness is never handed to a child. It must be earned in fire. His earliest memories were not of peace, but of exile. At the age of 9, his father was poisoned by the Tatars, ancient enemies of the Mongols, during a supposed feast of peace. With Yasugi's death, his family was cast out from their tribe, abandoned by allies who no longer saw value in a widow and her children. From that moment forward, Temujin was not a prince. He was a beggar, a boy with no tribe, no land, and no protection. He wandered the steppes with his mother, his brothers, and his sisters, living off wild roots, berries, and scraps. Hunger was not a guest, it was a constant shadow. His mother taught them how to survive when the world wanted them dead. It was during this period that Temujin tasted the bitter sting of betrayal, of brotherhood turned to threat. His half-brother Better tried to dominate the family, to control their meager resources. Temujin and his younger brother Kasar killed him, not for cruelty, but to protect their unity and future. It was a brutal act that defined a brutal world. In the steppes, even blood could be an enemy. As the boy became a teen, his enemies grew bolder. He was captured by the Taichudi, a powerful rival clan who feared his lineage and ambition. They bound him, shackled him with a wooden yoke, and paraded him like a prisoner. For days, he suffered humiliation and pain, left under guard and stripped of hope. But one night, a guard, moved either by pity or destiny, freed him. Temujin escaped into the night, barefoot and hunted, hiding in rivers and underbrush to survive. That escape wasn't just from captivity, it was from weakness. From that moment, he knew he would never be powerless again. He would never be at the mercy of another man's chains. Despite the odds, he began to gather allies. He returned to the camp of Togrul, Khan of the Karite, a former friend of his father. With nothing but a sable coat to offer, Temujin secured an alliance that would help him recover his stolen wife, Borte. She had been taken by the Merkits, a tribe Temujin had once wronged when his father abducted Holan. The cycle of vengeance was cruel and endless. Yet through courage and cunning, he rescued Borte. Their reunion was not just romantic, it was symbolic. She represented everything he had lost and everything he would fight to protect. In time, she would become queen not just of his heart, but of an empire. From the dirt and blood of the steppes, Temujin began building something no Mongol had imagined before: unity. Not the unity of clans through fear, but the unity of vision through loyalty. He began rewarding his men not for their lineage, but for their loyalty and talent. He uplifted slaves, outcasts, even former enemies, creating bonds stronger than blood. His closest companions, such as Jelm and Boworshu, were not born nobles. They were faithful, and that was enough. In this, Temujin rewrote the law of the steppes. He made loyalty sacred and betrayal unforgivable. He bound his followers to him with shared struggle, shared purpose, and the promise of a future they could build together. But even as he rose, the path was never straight. He suffered betrayals. He lost battles. He was hunted, doubted, and nearly destroyed. Yet in every defeat, he learned. In every betrayal, he grew sharper. His early life was not a parade toward power. It was a storm through fire and ice. A constant test. Each hardship tempered him like steel. He did not become Genghis Khan overnight. Before the Khan, there was the boy who crawled through snow with a starving stomach. The boy who held his mother's hand as they begged for scraps. The boy who learned that to lead men, he must first know the price of being led astray. Temujin, son of Yasujii, born of a kidnapped mother and abandoned tribe, forged his identity from ashes. He was raised by the wind and beaten by the world. And yet he stood, not just as a survivor, but as a leader who would eventually shake the very roots of civilization. The boy who once hunted rats for food would one day command an army that hunted kings. But in these early years, his crucible, he was not yet feared, not yet named, not yet written in the records of the world. He was simply a boy born of blood and sky. Temujin's survival was not merely about escaping death, it was about resisting disappearance. In a land where the wind erased footprints within hours and history was carved only into living memory, to be forgotten was the same as to never exist. His childhood had torn him from security, his adolescence had been spent clawing for breath in a storm of betrayals, and now, on the cusp of manhood, Temujin faced the most difficult test yet, defining himself not as a survivor of tragedy, but as a force of consequence. He could no longer just endure. He had to matter. But to matter in the Mongolian steppe was to take on the entire weight of centuries of tribal hatred, fractured loyalties, and a code of honor sharpened to kill. The political landscape of the steppes in the late 12th century was fractured beyond comprehension. Mongolia was not a country. It was a scattered and often savage land divided by hundreds of familial clans, all ruled by their own tribal lords, khans, and petty kings. There was no greater cause, no central law, and no notion of unity beyond the bloodline. Alliances shifted like sand, forged by necessity and broken without shame. In this landscape, Temujin stood as an anomaly. He believed not in blood but in brotherhood, not in tradition but in transformation. And that belief, though it had no name then, would one day redefine not only Mongolia, but much of the known world. But for now, Temujin had nothing. No army, no tribe, no security. What he had was vision. And vision, he would soon learn, was enough to both inspire the lost and provoke the powerful. His first steps toward rising from the shadows began with small but decisive acts of leadership. He rebuilt ties with old friends, some loyal to his late father, others drawn to the quiet strength in his voice. Among the most important of these was his childhood blood brother, Jamukha. The two had once shared everything: meals, dreams, ambitions. But while Temujin saw the future in merit and unity, Jamukha clung to the old world of aristocracy, where noble birth determined one's worth. This fundamental split would soon turn brotherhood into bitter rivalry. Before that final break, however, Temujin worked to restore his fractured household. He recovered Borte, his wife who had been kidnapped by the Merkits, through a daring raid assisted by Togrul, Khan of the Karaite, and Jamukha. It was a victory that cemented his legitimacy among his followers. Borte returned bearing their first son, Joki, whose paternity would later be questioned due to the timing of her captivity. But in those early days, it did not matter. She was home. Temujin's household, once scattered and starving, was beginning to resemble a court. Around this time, he began to attract a new kind of warrior. They were not aristocrats or nobles. They were outcasts, orphans, and opportunists who found something in Temujin that no other Khan offered: fairness. Among them were Jelm and Jeeb, both of whom would rise to become legendary generals. Temujin gave them loyalty in exchange for loyalty. He promised protection not because they were born into it, but because they had earned it. This reshaped the very nature of steppe warfare. No longer did bloodline determine rank. Under Temujin, ability did. But peace on the steppe was always fleeting. The alliance with Jamukha fractured quickly. Temujin's meritocratic ideals threatened the rigid clan structure upheld by the traditional aristocracy, of which Jamukha was the proud face. When Temujin was elected Khan by a small Kurultai of supporters in 1186, Jamukha declared war. Their armies met in the Battle of Dalan Baljit in 1187. Though Temujin's tactics were bold and his men loyal, they were outnumbered. Jamukha's army overwhelmed them, slaughtering many and capturing hundreds. In a show of medieval cruelty meant to send a message, Jamukha had 70 of Temujin's officers boiled alive in huge cauldrons. It was a horror that would sear itself into the soul of the young warlord. Temujin fled with the remnants of his followers. He had tasted his first major defeat, but unlike many before him, he did not vanish. He did not become one more ghost in the steppe's ever-growing graveyard. Instead, he disappeared only to re-emerge, stronger, colder, and more determined. He saw now what he faced. He was not just fighting other men, he was fighting a system. The world did not want to change. It feared change. But Temujin had already been changed by pain. He would drag the world with him, even if it had to be done by the hair. He focused next on uniting smaller, disaffected tribes and splintered factions, those who had been crushed or ignored by the dominant aristocratic clans. The Teichudi, the Naiman, the Tatar, all were watching him, either with suspicion or with interest. And slowly, he began turning suspicion into surrender and interest into allegiance. His army grew not by conquest alone, but by absorption. He didn't just conquer tribes, he welcomed them. He gave the poor a purpose, the voiceless a voice, and the betrayed a new banner to believe in. But it wasn't only kindness that cemented his authority. Temujin was ruthless when he had to be. He punished betrayal with death. He imposed harsh military discipline and expected absolute loyalty. He codified his values into what would later become the Asa, a code of law that emphasized loyalty, order, justice, and military discipline. The Yasa was not just a set of rules. It was the foundation of a new civilization. In the lawless chaos of the steppes, Temujin was building a legal and moral framework that would outlast his lifetime. His ambitions began to stretch beyond revenge. Around 1200, Temujin began to challenge the most powerful tribes directly. The Tatars, who had poisoned his father, became a prime target. With the assistance of the Karaite and Togrul, he launched a brutal campaign against them, utterly annihilating their leadership and incorporating the rest into his growing army. He was not simply satisfying old grudges, he was sending a message. The age of tribal vendettas was ending. The age of Genghis Khan was dawning. Yet, betrayal returned like an old ghost. Togrul, the Karaite Khan who had once been his ally and father figure, turned against him, likely manipulated by his son Singham, who feared Temujin's growing power. A fierce battle followed, and Temujin emerged victorious. Togrul fled, but was killed shortly after. The man who once blessed Temujin's early campaigns was now a discarded corpse on the side of the steppe. It was a chilling reminder. No alliance was sacred. No promise unbreakable. In the following years, Temujin's power snowballed. He defeated the Nomad, absorbed the Karaite, and outmaneuvered the Taichudi. With each victory, his legend grew. No longer was he the orphaned outcast. Now, even his enemies called him something else. Genghis Khan. In 1206, a grand Kurultai was called. Tribes from across Mongolia gathered. Warriors, leaders, elders, all met in a great assembly on the banks of the Onon River. And there, they crowned him Genghis Khan, universal ruler, not just of a tribe, not just of a region, but of all the Mongols. It was a coronation born from blood and bound in vision. For the first time in history, the scattered tribes of the Mongol steppe were united under one leader. Genghis Khan had done what no one before him had dared even imagine. He had risen from the ashes of betrayal, shaped by suffering and sharpened by war. He had not inherited power, he had taken it, inch by bloody inch. And now that he stood atop the world, he had once crawled across barefoot and starving. He did not look back. He immediately set to work transforming his kingdom into a war machine of terrifying precision. He reorganized his army into groups of tens, hundreds, and thousands, each with clearly defined leaders chosen by merit. He ensured supplies, messengers, and scouts functioned like nerves in a living organism. He trained his men not only in warfare but in discipline, communication, and loyalty to the empire rather than their clan. But beneath the ruthless general and brilliant organizer remained the boy who had once scavenged for roots to survive. That boy had learned to trust no one easily. He demanded absolute allegiance because he knew what betrayal cost. He offered second chances, but not third. He had learned that love could not protect you, that kinship could be a blade in your back, that mercy could be mistaken for weakness. Yet he also knew the value of mercy. He remembered the jailer who had freed him, the tribes that had followed him without promise of gold. He was brutal, but he was not cruel for cruelty's sake. His code, his yasa, applied even to him. In a world that respected only power, he gave his people something they had never had before: justice, order, and the certainty that a common man could rise to greatness. The shadows that once swallowed him had failed to keep him buried. He had not just survived them. He had become something new inside them. He had become the very force that banished them. In the spring of 1206, beneath the eternal blue sky of Mongolia, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in the blood-soaked history of the steppe, the fractious, warring tribes bowed to a single man. The Kurultai, the grand tribal council, raised Temujin high upon a white felt carpet and declared him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. It was not merely a title. It was a rebirth. The orphaned boy who once ate roots to survive was now the alpha wolf of a united horde. And yet, the world beyond the steppes did not shudder. To them, the Mongols were still ghosts in the grass, barbaric horsemen, unwashed and uncivilized, too fragmented to pose a real threat. But they were wrong. Genghis Khan was not a ghost. He was a storm gathering in silence. And now he was hungry. With his newly unified Mongol nation, Genghis Khan turned inward first, not to rest, but to build. He knew the steppe could no longer run on chaos. It had to breathe in rhythm. What he constructed was revolutionary, a state built not on lineage, but on loyalty, not on ancient law, but on a living code. His empire was divided into units of 10, a decimal-based military structure that ensured order. 10 men made a squad, 10 squads a company, 10 companies a regiment, 10 regiments a division. Each unit lived, trained, fought, and died together. There were no tribal distinctions, Mongol, Tatar, Merkit, Nayman, it didn't matter. Under Genghis Khan, they were all warriors of the horde. Merit ruled, and discipline was sacred. The Yasa, his unwritten law, governed all. Theft, desertion, rape, treason, each brought swift and brutal punishment. But it wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was order. In a world where betrayal was a currency and tribal wars erupted over spilled blood or stolen livestock, Genghis Khan had built something new, a moral code enforced by steel. He gave his people justice where there had only been chaos. And in return, he demanded absolute loyalty. He also established an elite guard, the Kashig, not just to protect himself, but to act as the core of his army and the heart of his ideology. These were warriors he trusted with his life, chosen not by blood, but by unwavering devotion. Even his sons were treated like commoners until they proved themselves. Joki, Chagatai, Ogidi, and Talyui would each serve, bleed, and earn respect, not inherit it. Yet unification and organization were only the beginning. The wolf of the steppe was not content with hunting rabbits in his own territory. His eyes turned outward. East lay the Jin dynasty of northern China, a wealthy, powerful state that had once played tribes against each other for its own gain. Genghis had not forgotten how they had supported the Tatars who poisoned his father. Now they would pay. In 1209, the Mongols launched their first major campaign against the Western Xia, a vassal kingdom of the Jin. It was a test, both for Genghis and for his newly formed empire. The campaign began with diplomatic gestures, as Genghis offered the Xia submission in exchange for peace. They refused. So he responded with fire and thunder. The Mongols besieged city after city, applying brutal siege tactics they had adapted and improved. Though originally steppe horsemen, Genghis had quickly absorbed Chinese and Persian siege engineers, learning to wield towers, catapults, and smoke warfare. By 1210, the Western Xia had bowed. Their ruler submitted to the Mongols, offering tribute and alliance. It was Genghis Khan's first victory beyond the steppe. But it was only the prologue to something far larger. In 1211, Genghis led the full force of the Mongol army into Jin territory. The invasion was not just military, it was psychological. He unleashed terror as a weapon, understanding that fear could shatter walls faster than siege engines. Cities that resisted were razed, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. Cities that submitted were spared, sometimes even rewarded. The message was clear: bend and live, resist and perish. The Jin army, bloated and slow, was unprepared for the speed and discipline of the Mongols. Genghis implemented complex feigned retreats, encirclements, and communication systems using flags, horns, and riders that allowed him to maneuver like no other force of his time. He took advantage of winter, launching attacks in the snow when enemies least expected. He crossed deserts and rivers thought impassable. And his men, hardened by years of survival and bound by unshakable loyalty, followed him into hell without question. By 1215, the Mongols had reached and besieged Chengdu, modern-day Beijing, the Jin capital. The city was massive and fortified, but its people knew what had happened elsewhere. Panic set in. Starvation began. The Jin emperor fled south, and after prolonged siege warfare, the city fell. The Mongols looted and burned it, and the name of Genghis Khan became synonymous with death and inevitability. He was no longer just a ruler of horsemen, he was a force of nature. But Genghis Khan was not a mindless conqueror. Even as he burned cities, he studied them. He spared artisans, engineers, scholars, translators, and physicians. He absorbed knowledge from every culture he touched. He created a courier system, the Yam, with stations and relays that allowed messages and orders to travel at astonishing speed across the empire. He encouraged trade, created religious tolerance, and understood diplomacy better than many kings. He wasn't just building an empire. He was building a civilization, one forged in war, but shaped by intellect. Meanwhile, old ghosts still lingered on the steppe. The Merkits, longtime enemies, had not been fully crushed. And there were rumors that the Nomad, another powerful tribe, were preparing for revenge. In 1216, Genghis sent his youngest son, Talyuri, to finish the Merkit threat. It was successful and brutal. The Merkits were wiped out. Survivors were absorbed or enslaved. The steppe, once a map of scattered tribes, was now unified under one banner. The eagle had eaten its rivals. By 1217, Genghis Khan had conquered more land in 10 years than Rome had in centuries. And yet, he was not finished. In fact, his next move would change the world forever. To the west lay the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and wealthy Islamic kingdom stretching from Persia to Central Asia. Genghis Khan initially approached them not with war, but with trade. He sent a caravan of merchants under a white flag, offering gold, goods, and peaceful relations. The Shah of Khwarezm, however, saw the Mongols as savages. He ordered the caravan robbed, its members executed. Genghis, still hoping to avoid war, sent 3 envoys to demand justice. The Shah, in a display of arrogance and stupidity, shaved the beards of 2 envoys and executed the 3rd. It was a mistake history would never forget. Genghis Khan was furious. He summoned his generals, raised his banners, and swore vengeance. The man who had once crawled barefoot across frozen rivers was now preparing to unleash a campaign of such magnitude and horror that it would alter the Islamic world forever. But that was still to come. For now, in the early 1220s, Genghis Khan stood tall over the ashes of cities, the bones of kings, and the rising tide of an empire unlike anything the world had seen. He was no longer merely the wolf of the steppe. He had become its ghost, its fire, its god. And still, the world had not yet grasped what had truly arrived. In the harsh winter winds of the early 1220s, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The Mongol Empire had risen from the dust like a monster formed of bone and thunder, and now it gazed westward. Genghis Khan, once a starving boy abandoned by his tribe, was now the ruler of the largest war machine the world had ever seen. The conquest of the Jin dynasty in the east had proven his military brilliance, but what loomed ahead was something even more dangerous. Vengeance. Not for territory, not for gold, but for dignity, shattered by arrogance, shaved beards, and murdered envoys. The Khwarezmian Empire had made a mistake that history would mark in blood. It had humiliated Genghis Khan. Now he would destroy it. The Khwarezmian Empire was no minor kingdom. It was a powerful Islamic empire stretching from Persia to Samarkand, a proud and complex civilization with cities gleaming under golden domes, thriving trade routes, and a ruling class drunk on their own certainty. At its helm stood Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, a man of ambition but no vision, wealth but no foresight. He had seen the Mongols as little more than steppe raiders, uncultured barbarians with no grasp of diplomacy. When he ordered the destruction of Genghis Khan's trade caravan and then executed one of his envoys while insulting the others, he did not just ignite a war. He invoked annihilation. Genghis Khan did not respond immediately with rage. He responded with calculation. He gathered intelligence, summoned his greatest generals, Jebe, Subutai, and his sons, and meticulously planned the greatest revenge campaign the world had ever seen. He mobilized over 100,000 cavalry, divided them into coordinated columns, and prepared to wage not just a war, but a philosophy of destruction. His message was clear: let no one ever think they can defile a Mongol banner and live. In 1219, the Mongols thundered into the Khwarezmian Empire. They moved like phantoms, silent, fast, merciless. They crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers once thought impassable. Their archers rained death from horseback. Their siege engineers, imported and improved from China and Persia, tore down walls. City after city fell. Otrar, Bokhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, Merv. These were not simply battles. They were orchestrated collapses. Genghis Khan played each city like a song of ruin, knowing where to strike and how to unmake centuries of pride. Bokhara, a sacred center of Islamic learning and trade, was one of the first jewels to fall. Genghis did not burn it immediately. He entered it with eerie calm, declaring to the trembling citizens that he was the punishment of God, and if you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me. These words, spoken not in anger, but in fact, would become immortal. He allowed the faithful to gather in their mosques. Then he took the city. He spared artisans and scholars, but annihilated resistance. The city was looted, its defenders slaughtered. He repeated this pattern with Samarkand, drawing the enemy into ambushes, feigning retreats, then encircling and crushing them like wolves herding sheep. But it was not just his military tactics that stunned the world. It was his use of psychological warfare. He allowed survivors to flee from conquered cities, wounded, broken, terrified, so they would carry word to the next town. The fear arrived before the horses did. Cities surrendered in a panic, believing resistance was hopeless. And they were often right. The Khwarezmian Shah, rather than face this terror, fled. He abandoned his capital and his people, retreating across the empire as the Mongols pursued him relentlessly. Genghis sent his general Subutai and the ferocious Jebe on a chase that would cover thousands of miles, from Persia through the Caucasus and into the very edges of Eastern Europe. They destroyed rearguards, shattered resistance, and left smoldering footprints behind them. Shah Muhammad finally died on a remote island in the Caspian Sea, sick, broken, and alone. A ruler who had once insulted Genghis Khan died without a kingdom or an heir to return to. But the Khan's vengeance did not end there. He turned toward the Shah's son, Jalal ad-Din, who had tried to rally resistance. In 1221, at the Battle of the Indus, Genghis crushed his army despite fierce fighting. Jalal escaped across the river, barely clinging to life. Genghis Khan did not pursue him, not because he feared him, but because he had already won. The empire Jalal sought to save was gone. The cities had been burned. The libraries turned to ash. The people scattered or slaughtered. In barely 2 years, an empire that had existed for over a century had been erased. Genghis Khan had not merely defeated a rival. He had redrawn the map of civilization. But amidst this whirlwind of devastation, something profound was happening. Genghis Khan was evolving. He was no longer simply a conqueror. He had become a force of destiny. His campaigns began leaving administrators behind, scribes, governors, and tax collectors. He established postal stations and promoted religious freedom in the ruins. He set the foundation for what would become the largest land empire in history. The blood he spilled was undeniable, but so was the order he imposed upon the ruins. His sons were beginning to take on greater roles. Joki, his eldest, was an enigma, brilliant but always shadowed by doubts about his birth. Chagatai was fierce and hot-tempered. Ogidi was calm, thoughtful, and increasingly seen as a likely heir. Talyui, the youngest, was ruthless and dependable. Genghis loved them all, but he also knew the greatest threat to his empire would come not from enemies beyond, but from succession within. He began grooming them not just for war, but for rule, teaching them discipline, law, and leadership. And yet, in his heart, Genghis Khan remained that boy from the steppe. He still lived simply, slept in tents, rode with his men, and hunted under the stars. He shared in their victories and wept over their deaths. He was feared by millions, but he feared very little, except the rod of complacency. Even at the height of his power, he never stopped preparing for war. In 1223, having devastated Khorazm, he sent Subutai and Jebe on a reconnaissance mission westward. Their journey would take them to the edge of Europe, where they annihilated a combined army of Russians and Kipchaks at the Battle of the Khalkha River. It was not a full invasion, only a message, a whisper on the wind. A taste of what the Mongols could do. The princes of Europe dismissed it, but the smart ones knew. Something was coming. Something unstoppable. By 1225, Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia. He was older now, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes sharper than ever. He had crushed the Jin in the east, annihilated the Khwarezmians in the west, and stitched together an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. And yet, he did not celebrate. He reorganized, rebalanced, reinstated laws. He called more Kurultais, demanded reports, interrogated governors. He asked not for praise, but for truth. Where were taxes not being collected? Where were laws being broken? What new threats lingered on the border? For Genghis Khan, there was no such thing as rest. There was only the next step. But fate, it seemed, had its own plans. In 1226, the Western Xia, who had submitted years earlier, betrayed him by failing to support his campaign. Genghis Khan, despite his age, mounted one final campaign to punish them. It would be his last. The army thundered through the desert, besieging and razing their cities one by one. The Xia pleaded for peace. He refused. It had never been about numbers. It was about principle. Betrayal, to him, was the only crime that could not be forgiven. By early 1227, as the campaign neared its end, Genghis Khan fell ill. Some say it was due to wounds sustained in battle, others from a fall from his horse, and some whisper of internal injury or sickness. But whatever the cause, the great conqueror began to fade. Still, he gave orders from his bed, ensuring the Xia capital was destroyed even as his life ebbed away. In August of 1227, Genghis Khan died. But his death was not announced. Not immediately. His body was hidden. His funeral procession killed all witnesses. The location of his burial remains unknown to this day, lost beneath the mountains or the rivers of Mongolia. Because for the Mongols, their Khan was not supposed to vanish. He was supposed to become part of the land, the wind, the sky. And in many ways, he did. By the time of his death, he had united over 1 million square miles under one banner, destroyed some of the most powerful empires of his time, and forged a legacy that would thunder forward through his sons and grandsons. The empire he left behind would continue to expand for decades, swallowing kingdoms, rewriting maps, and carrying the dream of order through fire. He had unleashed not just war, but history itself. And the world would never again be the same. Genghis Khan was dead. But no one dared to say it aloud, not at first. His body lay hidden, wrapped in secrecy, and guarded by the shadows of loyalty. His generals and family moved quietly through the dying embers of his last campaign in Western Xia, their faces grim, their hands steady. His last breath had vanished into the winds of the steppes, but the thunder of his empire had not stopped rolling. The Mongols did not bury a man that day. They buried a myth, a god-king, a soul whose voice still echoed in the clatter of hooves and the crackle of burning cities. The world didn't pause to grieve. It braced for the storm that would follow. Because Genghis Khan, in death, had become something more powerful than in life, an idea that could not be killed. The question that hung above the Mongol world now is not whether the empire would survive, but who would command it. Genghis had sons, Joki, Chagatai, Ogidi, Tolui, and each had strength, pride, and ambition. But the Khan had chosen his heir before death. Not his firstborn, Joki, whose bloodline was clouded in whispers and doubts. Not Chagatai, whose fury was his weapon, but whose fire lacked restraint. He had chosen Ogidi, the thoughtful, deliberate son, the one who saw not just the blade of the sword, but the length of its shadow. Ogidi's rise to power was not without tension. After Genghis's death in 1227, Tolui, his youngest and perhaps most loyal son, assumed regency, holding the throne in his brother's name. He did not challenge the succession. He served the empire until 1229, when the Grand Kurultai gathered to honor the will of the Great Khan. There, before the eyes of generals, sons, and statesmen, Ogidi was raised as the new Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. But this was not a transition of stagnation. It was a continuation of conquest. Under Ogidi, the empire did not merely hold. It surged. The thunder that Genghis had summoned now split the sky in all directions. Ogidi's reign would see the empire grow to its greatest extent, extending from the Sea of Japan to the gates of Vienna. The Mongol machine, forged by the hand of a father, was now wielded by his son with terrifying precision. In the east, the Jin dynasty, the same state that had once played Mongol tribes against each other, was finally obliterated. The campaign, started by Genghis, was brought to a decisive end in 1234. Northern China fell completely under Mongol control. Cities that had once stood proud with ancient walls and golden palaces were now silent under Mongol banners. The Mongol administration adapted, absorbing Chinese bureaucratic systems, adopting local governance while enforcing their own law. The sword of Genghis had torn through their lands, but his legacy planted roots in the ashes. In the west, Ogidi unleashed the most feared generals the world would come to know, Subutai and Bada Khan, son of Joki. Together, they would ride into the heart of Europe. It was not simply a military campaign, it was a seismic event. Between 1236 and 1242, the Mongols stormed into Russia, destroying the principalities of Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev. The frozen soil turned red with blood. Churches burned. Bells melted. The Mongols rode across the Volga and Danube with the same ease they had crossed deserts and mountains. Their adaptability knew no bounds. They fought in forests, in snow, in swamp, and always they prevailed. By 1241, they stood at the edge of Western Europe. At the Battle of Legnica, they crushed a combined force of Poles, Germans, and Knights Templar. Days later, at the Battle of Mohi, they destroyed the Hungarian army, killing tens of thousands and leaving Europe trembling. There was no force that could stop them. The Pope called for prayers. Kings built fortifications. But none of it mattered. The Mongols were coming. And then they stopped. The reason was not European victory. It was a death in Mongolia. Genghis Khan had died suddenly in December of 1241, likely from complications related to alcohol, a vice that had always clung to him. According to Mongol law and tradition, all royal campaigns had to cease and return to Mongolia for a Kurultai to elect the next great Khan. And so, just as Europe braced for annihilation, the Mongol armies turned away. It was not mercy that spared Europe. It was mourning. But the empire did not crumble. It paused, adjusted, and then continued. After Ogedai's death, a power struggle ensued. Talyui had already died in 1232, but his widow, Sorgatani Beki, rose as one of the most influential political figures in Mongol history. A Christian woman of intelligence and iron, she maneuvered brilliantly, ensuring her son, Monk, would become the next great Khan in 1251. It was under Monk that the Mongol Empire entered its next phase of dominance. Under Monk and his brother Hulagu, the Mongols turned south and west again, this time into the heart of the Islamic world. In 1258, they did what no one in the Muslim world thought possible. They destroyed Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. The libraries of the House of Wisdom were thrown into the Tigris River, blackening the waters with ink. The Caliph, spiritual leader of the Islamic world, was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death under horses' hooves. 1,000 years of Islamic civilization was brought low in a matter of days. It was not just a military conquest. It was a cataclysm. At the same time, Kublai Khan, another grandson of Genghis, was asserting control over China. By 1271, he would officially establish the Yuan dynasty, becoming emperor of all China. He ruled not just as a conqueror, but as a statesman, blending Mongol, Chinese, Tibetan, and Persian systems into a hybrid empire. His court became a place of art, science, trade, and diplomacy. Even Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, would one day walk its halls and write in awe of Kublai's splendor. The empire, once a dream born from the desperation of an exiled child, had now become a network of 4 massive khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, each ruled by a descendant of Genghis Khan, each still bearing the mark of his original law, his yasa, his vision. But even an empire forged in fire cannot escape time. As generations passed, rivalries grew. Succession disputes, cultural divisions, and religious conflicts began to fray the unity Genghis had died trying to create. The Khanates quarreled. The empire fractured. Yet even in its division, the spirit of Genghis Khan lived on. Trade routes expanded. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Confucianism were all tolerated. Languages mixed. Ideas flowed. Empires that had never spoken now exchanged goods and scholars. In its way, the Mongol Empire became the first true global engine of connection. Genghis Khan was long buried by now, his grave still lost beneath mountain, forest, or legend. But his dream walked the world. The child who had once killed to survive had reshaped Earth's destiny. His warriors still galloped across history books. His laws were still recited. His bloodline still ruled from palaces raised on lands he'd never seen. And somewhere in the wind, in the shifting silence between conquest and memory, you could almost hear it. A hoofbeat, a scream, a name that still made empires tremble. Genghis Khan. He was gone, dead for decades, maybe even centuries. His grave was nowhere, and yet everywhere. No monument marked the spot. No tomb whispered his name. But his shadow lingered, longer than marble, louder than bells, deeper than memory. Genghis Khan was no longer just a warlord or even an emperor. He had become something far more untouchable, a reality embedded in the fabric of the world. Long after the hooves stopped pounding and the banners were furled, the shockwaves of his empire continued to ripple across continents. The Mongol Empire had fragmented into rival khanates, each drifting into its own identity, ambition, and eventual demise, but the foundations he had laid beneath them would not erode so easily. While kings changed, borders shifted, and dynasties died, the Mongol system, the spine of Genghis Khan's vision, remained alive in law, culture, trade, and memory. It began with the roads. Before Genghis Khan, the Silk Road was a fragmented, perilous journey riddled with thieves, unstable kingdoms, and broken diplomacy. After him, it became the artery of the Old World. A Mongol courier could travel faster than any king's army. From China to the Black Sea, relays and posts were stationed like beating hearts, pumping information, goods, and people across thousands of miles. The Yam system, born under his command, allowed merchants to travel in security, carrying silk, spices, gold, knowledge, and even plague. Yes, even death rode the roads Genghis built. In the 14th century, long after his death, the Black Death spread from China to Europe along Mongol trade routes. It decimated cities, shattered economies, and ended feudal systems. The irony was cruel. The very infrastructure built to unite the world also delivered its darkest curse. But even this darkness bore strange light. In the aftermath of death came transformation, modern labor markets, scientific shifts, and the collapse of medieval stagnancy. The Mongol-created world, for better and worse, had no brakes. And it wasn't only roads and disease that flowed from Genghis Khan's empire. Ideas did too. The Mongols had no written tradition of their own before Genghis. But under his empire, literacy bloomed. Persian, Chinese, Tibetan, Uyghur, and Arabic scholars worked together. Astronomers, engineers, physicians, and poets found shelter in Mongol courts. The empire became an intellectual corridor where a Confucian monk might argue philosophy beside a Nestorian Christian, where a Persian architect might design a city in China, where an Islamic astronomer might teach a Mongol prince how to chart the stars. Religious tolerance, a principle Genghis Khan enforced with steel discipline, allowed Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and native shamanism to coexist, an unheard-of reality in a world built on dogma and holy war. He believed the gods could fight among themselves. His business was order, and it worked. His grandsons continued this policy. Kublai Khan employed Tibetan monks and Confucian ministers. The Ilkhanate of Persia converted to Islam while maintaining deep respect for other faiths. In the Mongol world, heresy was not a crime, disloyalty was. And then there was warfare. The dark art Genghis had mastered like no other. His tactics, feigned retreats, complex encirclements, total war, would be studied centuries later by Napoleon, Hitler, and American generals. His use of speed, mobility, discipline, and intelligence networks became the template for every modern military machine. He redefined what it meant to win a war, not just by conquering land, but by crushing spirit. Even administrative systems in Russia, Persia, and China carried the fingerprints of Mongol logic long after the Khanates dissolved. Taxation codes, census systems, and unit-based military organization remained embedded in the bones of states. Russia's centralized tsardom, Iran's Safavid architecture, China's bureaucratic machinery, all had Mongol blood in their veins, whether they admitted it or not. But perhaps the strangest aftershock of Genghis Khan's life was not institutional. It was biological. Genetic studies in the 21st century revealed a remarkable fact. Nearly 16 million men alive today carry the genetic marker believed to trace back to Genghis Khan or his male descendants. His blood, quite literally, still walks the earth, in markets, offices, farmlands, cities, deserts. His legacy is not just carved in books. It pulses through human DNA. And yet, modern history tried to forget him. For centuries, Genghis Khan was painted as a savage, a butcher, a demon from the East. Christian chroniclers of the Crusades saw him as the sword of the apocalypse. Islamic historians called his conquests the wrath of God. Chinese scholars buried his name under 100 censored volumes. Even in Mongolia during the Soviet era, speaking of him was forbidden. His statues were torn down, his history erased. But truth, like his empire, refused to die. In post-Soviet Mongolia, his name returned with roaring pride. Statues rose from the earth. His face appeared on currency. His story was taught not just as history, but as destiny. He was no longer a villain. He was a father, a founder, a legend. Because the truth about Genghis Khan is this: he was not simply a conqueror of land. He was a reformer of reality. He shattered old empires not just with weapons but with ideas. He destroyed privilege. He punished arrogance. He rewarded loyalty, merit, and courage. He took a world built on bloodlines and tore it down, replacing it with one where a servant could become a general, a peasant could govern, and a forgotten boy could rule the earth. Yes, he burned cities. Yes, he slaughtered millions. His hands were red with sins history cannot wash. But they were also the hands that reshaped how nations are built, how armies move, how cultures collide, and how humans live, govern, and remember. Genghis Khan's death did not end his reign, because his empire, though shattered, still hums beneath the skin of the modern world. His name lives in blood, in law, in trade, in fear, in awe. He was born from exile. He died in conquest. And he lives in history's pulse. Time forgets most men. Kings become footnotes. Generals fade into ruins. Even gods are eventually carved into silence. But not him. Not Genghis Khan. His face may not linger in a single painting. His grave may be lost, swallowed by the breathless steppes of Mongolia. His voice, never captured in ink, is gone. But somehow, in a world that worships the visible and the loud, Genghis Khan remains inevitable. He lives, not in one nation, not in one story, but in the bloodstream of the earth. In whisper and war. In fear and awe. In the rising of nations and the fall of certainty. He is not a chapter of history. He is history's fire. But how does such a legacy survive? It begins with a contradiction. Genghis Khan is the most misunderstood figure in the annals of mankind. For centuries, he was seen as a barbarian, a destroyer of culture, a sword with no soul. His name evoked terror in the hearts of medieval scribes. Christian monks called him the scourge of God. Muslim historians, traumatized by the fall of Baghdad, saw him as divine punishment. Chinese dynasties buried his memory beneath their pride. Even Russia, molded by his empire's long shadow, tried to shake him off like a plague. And yet, beneath the ash of his conquests, something eternal had taken root. Because Genghis Khan did not simply destroy. He rebuilt. He did not simply conquer. He redefined power. Where others ruled by accident of blood, he ruled by merit. Where others feared diversity, he mastered it. Where others enforced silence, he demanded movement. Of goods, of ideas, of people. The roads he forged weren't only for war, they were the veins of global connection. More than that, he built an empire that outlived him. A civilization so vast that the sun touched every corner of it. From the green hills of Hungary to the deserts of Gansu, from the Persian plains to the frozen rivers of Siberia, people told stories of the man who had no equal. They didn't always speak his name in reverence, but they always spoke it. And somehow, the man himself remained elusive. He did not build a marble tomb like the pharaohs. He did not carve his name in stone like the Romans. He left no autobiography, no palace, no golden crown. He asked for anonymity in death, not as humility, but as strategy. He chose to become a myth. And by becoming a myth, he became immortal. Even in modern times, he continues to live in strange, powerful ways. In Mongolia, his face gazes from money and statues. He is not just a national founder. He is a father figure, a spirit. In the West, his image has shifted from villain to visionary. Historians now see him not just as a conqueror, but as a lawmaker, an innovator, a bridge between East and West. He was the first to protect religious freedom as state policy. He was the first to create a postal relay system that spanned continents. He was the first to enforce a meritocracy among warriors. He was the first to unite nomads, city builders, poets, and killers under a single vision. And still, the contradictions remain. He killed millions, but created centuries of trade and peace across Asia. He burned cities, but seeded intellectual exchange between cultures that had never spoken. He came from nowhere, but shaped everything. He is not easily defined, because to define him is to trap him, and Genghis Khan was never meant to be caged. And what of his descendants? They ruled empires. Kublai Khan sat on a Chinese throne. Hulagu shattered Baghdad and built a dynasty in Persia. The Golden Horde dominated Russia. The Mongol emperors of India traced their lineage to him and built the Taj Mahal. The blood of Genghis Khan passed through the silk of sultans and the ink of scholars. His name softened over time, blurred by borders and languages, but his impact sharpened. And then came the modern age. Science would one day reveal that nearly 1 in 200 men alive today carry his genetic marker, proof that his life wasn't a ripple, but a flood. A single man had altered not just the world map, but the human genome. His legacy lives not only in memory, but in bone. Still, he remains a mystery. Where is he buried? How did he die? Why did he rise when so many others fell? The myths are endless. That his funeral procession killed all who witnessed it. That a river was diverted to hide his tomb. That he sleeps beneath the ground, waiting for Mongolia to call his name again. But maybe, just maybe, Genghis Khan doesn't need a tomb, because his real grave is the modern world. Every nation that negotiates across borders. Every culture that respects faiths beyond its own. Every system that values merit over bloodline. Every trade network, every highway, every courier system carries the echo of a horseman who once thundered across the steppes with fire in his eyes and the world in his grasp. He was not perfect. He was not kind. He was not gentle. But he was transformational. A man who should have been forgotten, who was meant to die in exile and starvation, changed everything. And so, in every whisper of wind across the Eurasian plain, in every grave of empires he helped shape, in every dream of power, order, or rebellion, there is still Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan had emerged from the darkness, not just as a survivor, but as a world shaper. The steppe no longer whispered his name in pity. Now, it roared it in awe, and the world, still divided and unaware, was about to meet its greatest storm. The dust has settled. The blood has dried. The bones of cities lie silent beneath the sand. Empires have risen and fallen like tides against the cliffs of time, and the Mongol banners, once the terror of the earth, have faded into forgotten winds. And yet, even now, centuries removed from the thunder of hooves and the howl of conquest, a question lingers, fragile, burning, unresolved. What was he really searching for? Because Genghis Khan was more than a warlord, more than a ruler, more than a shadow on the steppes. He was a question wearing human skin. He was the agony of abandonment, the rage of a child left to die, the defiance of a man who refused to be erased. He was the broken boy who became the breaker of kings. But when the swords were sheathed and the fires cooled, was he ever whole? Was it revenge he chased? Vengeance for a poisoned father, a kidnapped wife, a shattered childhood? Was it power? The thrill of commanding men, of shaping fate, of standing where no one else dared? Or was it peace? The aching hope that, by taming the chaos outside, he could quiet the storm within? He conquered the world. But did he conquer himself? We don't know. We can only guess. Because he left us no confession, no diary, no dying breath captured in parchment. He disappeared into the silence he mastered so well. All we have are his actions and the tremors they left behind. And those tremors force us to ask deeper things. Can civilization be born from fire? Genghis Khan destroyed more than any man before him. And yet, from the ruins, he built something vast, something durable. He created laws where there was only blood. He united warring tribes under a single dream. He offered freedom of belief in an age of holy wars. He expanded trade, communication, and curiosity across a world that had never been so connected. He was a monster to some, a prophet to others. But he was always necessary because he emerged not from greed, but from the broken seams of a world already drowning in injustice. So then we ask, was Genghis Khan the evil or the answer? We like our story simple, good or bad, hero or villain. But Genghis Khan refuses the script. He burned books but protected scholars. He slaughtered cities but spared talent. He crushed faiths but upheld religious freedom. He was a contradiction wrapped in destiny, and maybe that's why he endured, because he mirrors what we are, capable of both brilliance and brutality, order and chaos, destruction and design. He was not a god. He was a man, but a man who forced the world to move, who took history by the throat and dragged it forward, whether it wanted to come or not. And the eternal question he leaves us is not about war or empire, but about ourselves. What will we do with power once we hold it? Because in his rise is our reflection. In his choices, our warning. In his silence, our echo. The world he left behind, its borders, its systems, its scars, still belongs to us. And as we build cities atop the ashes he left, as we walk digital silk roads, as we speak in the many tongues that once bled beneath his banners, we must keep asking, are we builders? Or are we breakers? Are we his descendants in blood or in spirit? Genghis Khan does not answer. He never did. But he waits in the wind, in the myths, in the marrow of history. He was born into exile. He rose into legend. He vanished into eternity, and he left behind a single, haunting truth that stretches beyond empire, beyond death. Greatness is never clean, and power is never silent. And so, the story of Genghis Khan comes to a close, not with silence, but with an echo that still shakes the world. If this journey moved you, if it made you rethink what power truly means, then don't let it end here. Like this video to keep history alive. Subscribe to become part of a growing community that believes in storytelling with depth, and share it with someone who still sees Genghis Khan as only a name in a textbook. Comment below and tell us, was he a brutal tyrant, a visionary leader, or something far more complex? Because in the end, his legacy isn't just buried in the past, it's alive in the questions we still ask today. And some stories, like his, don't really end, they just wait for someone bold enough to listen.